Over the past few months, a lot of us have been re-examining the injustices that are inherent in our culture and in our institutions. Since the death of George Floyd, we've heard many voices express their frustration with our system, and some folks have taken to the streets in protest, calling for justice. One of the conversations that has been ongoing since June has called into question how we look back on our nation's founding and which figures from our past we choose to revere. One of the figures that has been at the forefront of that conversation is Thomas Jefferson. Protesters have called for us to understand Jefferson's legacy differently, with recognition for the pain and suffering that he caused. Yes, Jefferson was the man who crafted that critical phrase, all men are created equal, and yet Jefferson owned 600 slaves throughout his lifetime. Enslaved people cooked and cleaned for Jefferson, and his plantation relied on their labor. Paradoxically, although Jefferson only freed 2 slaves during his lifetime, he often condemned the evil institution that he participated in and benefited from. He wrote, "I tremble for my nation when I reflect that God is just." That brings up so many questions. How could a man of faith who knew he was a part of something so deeply wrong continue in such a obviously and terribly hypocritical manner? One of the counter arguments we frequently hear is that Jefferson was a good man, but a man of his time. But aren't good men of faith compelled to act when faced with such evil? Now, I don't mean to make a moral comparison between the two, but in today's reading, Jesus struggles to overcome his own biases that were inherent in the society he lived in. He encounters a woman who begs him to help her tormented daughter. Jesus is encouraged by his disciples to disregard the pleading woman. "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us," they said. She is a Gentile. The disciples see her as a foreigner. Jesus himself has also been taught by the world he was born into to ignore the woman. So he calls her need into question. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. But she responds, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Jesus then comes to a great realization. Regardless of where this woman is from, she too is worthy of God's mercy. Then Jesus performs a miracle for the foreign woman, which transcends the divisions of his time and clears the path to salvation for all. The miracle fulfills a prophecy we read about in Isaiah, which promises that God will send forth a servant to spread the good news, telling all people, regardless of where they are and who they look like and where they are from, that they will be invited to follow God and become a part of his covenant family. So, what about us and the society we're a part of? How can we transcend and follow the example of Christ? Without a doubt, we're born into a culture plagued with prejudice and injustice. And it seems wrong for us to point out all the flaws of our ancestors without some introspection. To that end, Nicholas Kristof wrote a really thought-provoking piece in the New York Times in which he asks, in response to our re-examination of flawed historical figures, what will our great-grandchildren find bewilderingly immoral about our own times and about us? Kristof argues that we have an obligation to think deeply about our own moral myopia today and address it while there is still time. What immoral cultural norms or institutions are we a part of, and do we play a role in today? What Kristof points out animal cruelty and our system of factory farms and slaughterhouses whose practices, when revealed, often offend our humane sensibilities. Kristof also mentions our neglected poverty in less developed countries and our contribution to climate change. I think of our reliance on manufactured goods from overseas factories with horrendous working conditions, or perhaps our treatment of migrants at the southern border. I'm sure you all can think of other ethical blind spots our society has. So, In 200 years, will our legacy be seen in the same light as Jefferson's? I tremble for my nation when I reflect that God is just. All of a sudden, that line becomes uncomfortably relatable. One piece of scripture that reassures me comes from the book of Micah. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? As we've seen, doing what's right all the time can actually be quite difficult, but that reality can be forgotten all too frequently. In fact, I usually feel like I know the difference between what's right and what's wrong. I often believe that I'm on the right side of history. And I think most people tend to share this confidence in their own self-righteousness. We're so certain that we are free from sin, we find it easy to cast judgment on others for their own faults and missteps. But then that passage reminds us to love mercy and walk humbly with God. We are warned that we are all woefully flawed and frequently wrong, and we must carry that burden while remaining modest. So, of course, we should do our best to extend that mercy and humility to our neighbors. And when we fail, which we are certain to do, all we have to fall back on is God's mercy. And what a gift his mercy is, a blessing that goes beyond the privileges of this life.